It's great to be here. It's my first time ever in New Orleans, actually. And like the rest of the world, New Orleans holds now a very special and very unfortunate distinction in all of our hearts and our consciousness. And I must say, it's sort of surreal experience to drive as I was driven from the airport and to ask, okay, well, how is this street, and where did the displaced people from this neighborhood go, and oh, there's the Superdome, and you know, in some ways, you who've lived here and who've gone through this probably have a greater capacity to empathize with what to many of us are abstractions of displacement and of the kind of pain of brokenness that happens both in terms of natural disasters that have man-made components like this one, or straight man-made atrocities of the kind that I'm here to talk about this afternoon. So it's been amazing already just to get to know New Orleans a little bit for those of you who've lived through this, and I look forward to the rest of my day and my evening here. What I thought I would do is, and in Q&A you should feel free to ask questions on whatever topic or sort of subtopic you're interested in, from Obama to Monstergate to Darfur. Happy to talk about any of those. But I want to focus my very brief remarks here just on Darfur and give you some good news and then some bad news. And by the size of the crowd here, just on an event focused on Darfur, I suspect you know most of this, but let me spell out what I take to be the good news and the bad news. The good news is that for the first time in the history of the United States, we have in this country an anti-genocide constituency that has grown up in the last 4 or 5 years out of nowhere. It grew up largely student-driven. There are 500 college chapters for students taking action to end genocide stand. There are 500 high school chapters. Evangelicals are a part of it. Jewish groups are a part of it. People who watch the film Hotel Rwanda are a part of it. People who miss the film Hotel Rwanda and just find genocide in the 21st century obscenity are a part of it. People who love George Clooney are a part of it. It's an amazing amalgam of America, basically, and it's an amazing window into America, and this kind of conceit that still drives people, almost anachronistically, to believe that they can change their government's habits simply by speaking up and by putting political pressure on government. The lesson of the 20th century, and I'll touch upon this later in more detail in my other lecture, but the lesson of the 20th century is that governments never really gravitate toward dealing with these kinds of crimes naturally or eagerly. That is, we haven't ever really seen top-down presidential leadership on genocide prevention or suppression. We've seen leadership on genocide remembrance after the fact, and apologies and memorials and so forth, and that's not nothing, because that is part of what fuels the movement, because it creates a kind of stable of remorse that can be drawn upon for political reasons. But the other way leadership happens is when there is sufficient political pressure and when leaders feel that there is a political price to be paid for doing little about genocide. So again, back to the movement, what these amazing young people primarily have come up with, rendering this movement far more sophisticated than many human rights analogs, are such things as genocide grades. Right now, some of you may know that if you're a member of Congress or you're a U.S. Senator or Governor, you will actually be awarded a grade of some kind on the basis of your response to Darfur or your grade on genocide generally. So you now have members of Congress, U.S. Senators, governors running around scrambling basically upon being told that they got D-minuses on genocide, trying to figure out how do they get a B-. It's just like what goes on this campus. I'm sure at least Harvard is any indicator. Desperate groveling to figure out how they can get a passing grade, and that could mean supporting additional allocations of humanitarian aid, or more accountability, or the deployment of helicopters to the new UN force. But it's real. There's now also a 1-800-genocide number where you sounds almost kitsch, almost embarrassed by it, but you dial 1-800-genocide, and what it does is it tries to lower the transaction cost and lower the burden of figuring out how you get in touch with your congresspersons. You dial 1-800-GENOCIDE, put in your zip code, and you'll be directly connected, and given also a little script to read so that you're part of a chorus of appeals. So you might say, well, what has all of this achieved? All of this pressure, all of this awareness, and the answer is an enormous amount. $3 billion has been spent by the Bush administration on keeping the refugee and the displaced person camps afloat in Darfur. It was the Bush administration that led in the UN Security Council in order to get a resolution passed to deploy 26,000 peacekeepers to Darfur. The Bush administration, some of you know, cannot stand the International Criminal Court, hates it. John Bolton, the former US ambassador to the UN, said that unsigning the Clinton administration's signature on the Rome Treaty for the ICC was the greatest day of his life. Says something about his life, I think. But John Bolton had to sit there in the UN Security Council chamber and allow the United States to basically be a part of sending, referring the atrocities committed in Darfur to the International Criminal Court. The US abstained, whereas all of its rhetoric and its unsigned treaty and so forth would have indicated that it would have used its veto power on the council, but the pressure was too great from below. To the degree that there's been any political process to speak of in Darfur, it's come about because of spasmodic US diplomatic engagement. And this is all, it's linear. If somebody, a graduate student, did a chart of pressure on the administration from around specific campaigns, sub-campaigns that are part of the Darfur movement, and output from the administration, you'd see a linear correlation. The bad news, of course, is that people in Darfur are still dying. 400,000 people have died so far. Close to 3 million people have been displaced. Although the suffering has been pronounced and profound for the last 4 years, what is now happening is the Sudanese government is getting more and more emboldened the more time that passes, and is expelling a greater and greater number of humanitarian aid groups that are active in Darfur. Basically inside Sudan, the Sudanese government is still in control. So the fact that aid groups go into these territories and start to feed people doesn't mean that those aid groups are in control in any way of the so-called camps. And to say camps is misleading, and I know, again, maybe in New Orleans, you guys know this better than most. But to talk about a refugee camp, before I started visiting them 15 years ago, I used to imagine that there were like these gated camps with a door and you had like a swipe card or something, you know, you go, and that's not what it's like. It's just a big field of human suffering, and aid groups come in and try to salvage what is there, try to prevent disease and starvation. But as many of you know, what has happened is the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed militia forces continue to circle the camps, the fields. And in order for the people in the camps to make the humanitarian aid that the US government pays for in bulk, 3/4 of the international aid is paid for by the US government. But in order for that aid to be edible, people need firewood. In order to get firewood, women have to leave the camps, and they have to cut through those Janjaweed and those Sudanese government controls. There's nobody in charge in refugee camps or in displaced person camps. It is still a kind of scavenger hunt for human persistence and existence. So that's very bad, that the aid groups are getting expelled. They supply water in many of these places, clean water, sometimes medicine, sometimes food. But as soon as the Sudanese government snaps its fingers, the groups are expelled, and many, many more of them have been expelled in the last 6 months than in any prior 6-month period. The way that aid workers talk about this is they say the humanitarian space is shrinking, and that is what is happening. Now what that means is many more people die of starvation, of disease, and again, because there's less of an international presence, the Sudanese soldiers and Janjaweed militia people who are patrolling around the camps feel that they have license to do whatever they want in ducking into the camps. Because again, these are not gated or guarded facilities of any kind. So that's the first bit of bad news. The other bit of bad news is that for all of the activism in this country, in this remarkable country, there has been nothing analogous to the anti-genocide movement in other countries. And thus, European governments or other democracies that you might think would be just as exercised about genocide as we are, have been strangely complacent and or jarringly complacent, let me say. Not so strangely in that their behavior maps with that of our government in the past, with Western governments in general, with democracies in general. And if you're not hearing it, it requires top-down presidential head of state leadership in order for policies to come about that are different, and they're not hearing it. And so they're kind of coasting along and worrying about economic ties or counterterrorism or the euro or whatever it is that different governments are worried about. So the United States has not been joined internationally. And as a result, while, as I mentioned, there's been profound and sustained U.S. leadership in the Security Council to get a UN peacekeeping force into Darfur, there has been very little follow-up leadership in order to ensure that that force comes into existence. So, again, as many of you know, 26,000 troops authorized now many months ago, only 9,000 yet present in Darfur, and really probably only about 1,000 have come in since the new authorization, the shift from an African Union force to the United Nations force. So that 9,000 is even misleading because the African Union force has been there for the last 3 or 4 years. So really they just re-had it and called themselves a new force. So that comes back to this point about advocacy and how other governments are not facing pressure themselves to put their troops or their police into harm's way. And one of the effects of Iraq, which I'll talk about later, is that the specter of quagmire hangs over many, many international engagements. To some degree, this is good faith. This is a skepticism born of, gosh, what if we go into an Arab country and the jihadis follow, and it becomes very dangerous, and we lose public support at home, and more people die because of our presence. There's some good faith question asking like that, but some of it is bad faith use of Iraq as a way of just not actually having to have the difficult domestic conversation about whether mass atrocity is worth the deployment of resources, diplomatic, economic, or police or peacekeepers. So right now, the key issues are threefold. What John Prendergast, my partner in crime, calls 3 Ps of genocide prevention, and they are one, what I already mentioned, the protection force, getting it from 9,000 to 26,000. That's going to be a major challenge, getting other countries to contribute, getting the United States to put the kind of diplomatic pressure on other countries and to supply diplomatic and economic incentives to other countries so those countries want to be a part of this force, to transport troops from other countries to Darfur, to work behind the scenes with and pressuring China to get Sudan to open up the country to these peacekeepers. P for protection. Number 2, P for political process. Any protection force, even if you had 26,000 troops tomorrow, they're not going to be able to save everybody indefinitely in Darfur. Long-term peace and stability and the kind of recovery that one fantasizes about for that region will require a peace deal. And yet there has been no high-level U.S. engagement at a diplomatic or political level, basically for 2.5 years, since Robert Zellick, the Deputy Secretary of State, left the State Department. And the third is punishment, and this is the really challenging one to get through the UN Security Council. Asset freezes of people who are responsible for mass atrocity, travel bans, just making their work, their arms deals a little more difficult, making their travel a little more difficult, making the Sudanese government know there will be a price to be paid in terms of an international stigma. And this has been the hardest to bring about. As a result, when it comes to point 1 and point 2, protection of the political process, Sudan hasn't really felt itself under the kind of multilateral pressure that makes it feel it has to cooperate with the peacekeeping force or with the political process. So I think there's a lot to be done on each level, but ultimately, one of the ways perpetrators think, no matter where they are, is really in terms of costs and benefits. And so if we're serious as a country, maybe it'll take an Obama administration or a Clinton administration or a McCain administration to be serious, but we do know what it looks like when an administration is serious. And even though the U.S. has lost considerable influence over the last 7 years, even though China is, of course, on the rise geopolitically as well as economically, Russia resurgent, there's an awful lot different about the international system today than 7 years ago, for sure. But that said, we haven't even begun to max out on what a committed American administration could actually achieve if it did the really hard work behind the scenes in order to get other countries to join in trying to stop these horrors.